We're going to cover some Management Studio basics for Udemy students taking my ETL course. So this will be SQL Server Management Studio and just some basic things you need to understand. Since this is an ETL course, you don't need to know as much as a SQL Server developer or a database administrator would need to know. And outside of keeping some scripts for receipts just in case your DBA asks, I would suggest doing as much as you can do outside of Management Studio if you don't have to do much inside of Management Studio. But there are some things that you'll need to know how to do for this course. So the first thing that you'll want to do is create a database called the ETL course. Now I already have the database created, however we'll go ahead and walk through the steps of doing that. So for the sake of this course, we will call this ETL course. And you'll notice it's kind of automatically filling in information. And this is SQL Server Management Studio 2008 R2. So if you're using 2012, which is probably what you have, that will work as well. As long as it's above 2008 R2, you're fine. Now for this course, we don't necessarily have to worry about auto growth unless your computer is restricted. But we'll go ahead and, wow, that pops up in a completely different window. And we'll change it. So I usually will start my databases out at 100 meg, and then I have unrestricted file growth, and then on the log I do 50 meg starting out and unrestricted file growth. If you are going to be a DBA or you are going to be a developer, one thing about creating databases or whatnot is that every environment you'll have to know how they do, how they start their thing, or how they start their size and whatnot. In fact, the current environment that I'm working in is actually very different than the environment before, and the environment before was different than the one before that one, and so they all kind of have their approaches on this. But usually my log initially, if I know that my database is going to be simple, I start it out at half of what my data file is going to be. Now, as far as program files, this is the default location. You can choose this. What I do, and I'm a little bit different here, is under my C drive I have a data folder and then I have a log folder. And so what I would suggest is putting a data folder, putting your data file under the data folder I should say, and then putting your log under the log. That's just my suggestion. You can do what you want. And the reason why I do it this way is it keeps it organized. Understand in an actual database server in an environment, they're going to be on separate drives. But because this is just a test machine, it doesn't really matter. And then of course I always name my data, which will be the name of the database .mdf. So I always just check that the name is enforced _ log.ldf. And the reason for this is when it comes to backups, restores, if you stick to a naming convention always, you can automate things. When you are always changing things, you can't. And then of course the next thing is go to options and make sure that it's on simple. We're not going to do anything where we need full recovery. Now y'all will click OK. I'm going to click cancel because the database is already built, but y'all will click OK. So, and probably y'all see something like this. So you'll have an ETL course. If you right click on the ETL course and click new query, it brings up the query window. This window right here, this big white space, is where you will be executing your scripts. It's where you'll build stored procedures, which will be important. Any T-SQL script is where you will execute it here. It's very similar to the PowerShell white window as well. You have the blue window, which kind of tells you what's going on, and then you have the white window where you're actually writing scripts. So that's important to understand. If you want to back up your database as you're doing work and you're getting data, you can actually back up the database. There's actually several ways that you can do it, but we'll go ahead and we'll just show this example here. And again, you don't have to worry about doing this. This is only if you're like, okay, well I got a lot of information here, I don't want to lose my information. Okay, so, but I do want to show you that a lot of the things that you can do in this window, the new query window, you can actually do by right-clicking on your database and say tasks, and you can see backup is one of them. Now, the reason why I do things through the query window, especially, it's a good habit to get into. If you're working in an environment and you do something wrong and your DBA contacts you and he or she asks you, okay, so what did you do, because we're having this problem or that problem, and you'll see, by the way, it backed it up, and you will see the AK file. So he or she asks you, what did you do to our environment? We're kind of curious because yada 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 yada. And you're like, oh, I don't remember. I was, clicking around and I did some task and I forgot what I did. They're not going to like you. And the reason why they're not going to like you is because you don't have a receipt for what you did. If you provide a receipt, it's very easy to undo. Well, it's not super easy, but it's easier than if someone's like, oh, I have no idea what I did. So the reason why I would get in the habit of scripting is because you will build better relationships with people that you work with, especially DBAs. They are, you're going to make mistakes. That's going to happen, and a good DBA understands that. But what's going to make a good developer from a bad developer is the fact that the good developer will have evidence of what they did. A bad developer will, oh, well, I have no idea. I don't remember. So one of my things that I always do, and it's really interesting, when I first started way back in the day, I think I updated 1,300 rows, and I was only trying to update one, and I was able to undo it, which is lucky, but I haven't made a mistake since then. That was really good. But I still, because I'm paranoid, what I always do is when I save what I did, I always save my receipts. So I'll save, and let's just use this as an example. And so I'll put down on the receipt what I did, and so I'll say backup database, and then I'll do underscore, and then I'll sit there and I'll say, okay, so it's 04/29, 2014. Why? And the reason is because yesterday this horrible thing happened on our database. I can go in and I can access it. If you solve like tickets, let's say your company has tickets that you solve and they have numbers to those tickets, then instead of putting backup database, put ticket number 41325678. Again, it's super handy to be able to just send that to the DBA, and they're like, oh, this is awesome. And I can tell you how many times I worked with people who they don't have evidence of what they did, so I'm left debugging their errors, and I'm like, what did you do? Well, I clicked right click here, and I pushed one of these, and I don't remember which one, and I'm like, okay, that's not cool. So that's kind of something that just get in good practice of. And so while you're in this course, when you're not working for anyone, it's a really good idea, because you want to build good relationships with DBAs. There's a joke that DBAs and developers don't really get along with each other, but even when I first started, I always worked well with both, and because I've been in both positions, and it's one of those things where it's a good idea to get into, because if your DBA likes you, that goes very far. Okay, so one of the things that you'll be doing in this course is you'll be creating stored procedures, and that's something that I want to emphasize. Understand, you can run queries here. For instance, we can insert into a table. I think I have a tweets table, and we can say insert values, yada yada. Okay, that's great. We can update, and there's videos that link to showing you how to do that. We can delete from tables, and then of course we can let's see, select from tables. We can select top 1 star from tweets. Okay, but the big thing that I want to show you all how to do is how to create a stored procedure, because this may be unfamiliar, and I linked to some code, but for the Management Studio basics here, what I want to go over is how to create a stored procedure. So create procedure, never ever do this. That's the naming convention of Microsoft's procedures, so always do something else, and I'll say new procedure. And this is kind of the syntax of, not kind of, it is the syntax of creating a stored procedure. So you have create procedure as begin end. Okay. Now there's some things that can go here. For instance, if we were going to include a parameter, we would say param, right? And we'll say navarchar, let's say 50. Okay, and so we could literally say our stored procedure will be select, or let's do print param. And so that's our procedure. We created it. Now, the key in this course is to note the syntax. It's create procedure, procedure name, the parameter, whatever the parameter is. It could be an int, a decimal, it could be a character, it could be a string. In this case, it's a string. Then we put as, and then begin and end, and inside of the procedure. Now, yes, there are other things that you can do. We can, have an output up here and such. But for the sake of this course, that's not going to be something you need to know. So when we execute the stored procedure, so we call it basically, we do new procedure, and we'll say hello. Well, I don't like hello world. There. And so we will execute the stored procedure, and it prints hi. So that's something that you will use a lot. So what's the purpose of a stored procedure? It's reusable code. It's kind of similar in C# to having classes. The reason why you build classes is so that you can just take a class, and I do this a lot, and you can just add them to new projects, right? You can save a class. You could also you can compile a DLL and do it that way too. But you can just take a class and you can add it to other projects that you have, and then you can call those lines over and over and over again. Well, it's the same thing with a procedure. By having a stored procedure, you can just reuse that code. And you can always find people on the internet, this is how the internet works, that hate stored procedures, and they're like, oh, they're incredibly stupid and blah, 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 blah. That always happens. Don't worry. People on the internet, I can promise you, I can find a critic for anything on the internet. If you give someone a blog, they will always have something negative to say about something. So it's kind of like I don't like SSIS. Yeah, that's how it works. So so that's how you create a stored procedure. That's the syntax there. And that's something that you're going to use a lot. And I would suggest, especially initially, when you're doing some of the processes, figure out exactly what processes you do a lot, and then automate them by putting your parameters here that may change. Whatever's going to be dynamic in each time you call, put your parameters here, and then save it as a stored procedure. And that way you don't have to rewrite it each time. I don't like rewriting code. It's kind of something that annoys me to no end. Let me kind of, hold on a second, show you an example of what I'm talking about outside of Management Studio and kind of the argument for reusing code. Okay, and outside of backing up your database, storing stored procedure, and then executing, you have the basic commands like select, insert. There is a video called Insert and Update Basics. I would go over that. I'd refrain from using delete. You can, but be careful, because delete, if I say delete from tweets, and I can lose it, this will literally wipe out every tweet in my table, and I don't really care about keeping any of that data. But you'll see, I just wiped out the entire table, which in that table was a test table, so there's only 520 rows. That's why I'd be careful about tweets. If you use delete from, you definitely want to specify where. Unless you want to wipe out everything, I'd be careful. And you can also, if you want to clean an entire table, I'd also suggest using this. Truncate table will wipe out a table. The difference is it's a lot faster, and it doesn't flood the log. Okay, let's see here. 1 second, I'm going to, here it is. Okay, yeah, this is a good example. So under the folder ETL on SQL Server on my GitHub, I'll give you a good example of reusing code. This is a class, read files, that I use a lot. I've used it so many times. I was like, you know what, I'm just going to write it. All of this, I can just copy and paste this, or I can add this class constantly to new projects if I know I'm going to need to access a file. And I can call these methods by adding it to my project anytime. I mean, they're things that I use on a regular basis, so I never have to rewrite this again. You write it once, it's done. It's the same thing with stored procedures, and all that has to happen is add it. Now, some people will be like, well, you can compile it into a DLL, and that's true, and I could do that. It's going to be the same. Either you're going to add a class, you're going to add a DLL. But the idea is it makes it super easy to reuse code. So that's one of the reasons why I like stored procedures. And like I said, if you want to find some critics, you can find those. Some other things to note is that you can create views. It's not going to be really relevant for our course. They're like saved select statements. There's some particulars about views as well. Creating a table, creating a table, let's go over that. So that's creating a stored procedure. Creating a table, so we have create table, and we'll say table name for the sake of this example. We'll say column 1, and then we'll do int, we'll do column 2, varchar 100. A lot of table creation, as you know, in the course is automatic, so you don't have to worry about it that much. But in case you want to create a table, the syntax is going to be create table, the table name, open parentheses, and then the column details are going to be inside the parentheses. So in this case, we have column 1 is the name of our column. If you're going to use a keyword, you want to wrap it in brackets. Keywords will cause issues. You can use brackets, you don't have to. If you want to force a column to not be null, which means it can't have empty values, you would say not null. Otherwise, the default is it's going to allow null values. You can also specify on a table creation if you want a default value. Suppose we wanted to add timestamp to this table, and by the way, timestamp, as you'll see, is a keyword. So what do? We're going to wrap it with brackets, timestamp. We could say date, and to specify a default, we would say default get date. And what that means is every time we insert into this table right here, column 1, column 2, this is going to automatically insert the date. It's going to automatically add a date to that row. Okay. If we want to do a field that starts at 1 and increments by 1, we could do int identity 1 starting at 1 incrementing by 1. And that would be like a field that row 1 is 1, row 2 is 2, row 3 is 3, row 4 is 4. And I don't think you will need to know this, but you can look into it if you would like to create a table, because once you move, a lot of times in the transform process, it's very useful to have a field like this for mathematical functions. For instance, if I'm calculating a 200 SMA, Wilson score, you name it, this is a very handy. The only reason why I really use it is for algorithms. And it's funny because I've worked at companies that are like, yeah, we don't really keep our ID field from 1 to whatever. They'll have all these different like skips and stuff like that. And I always know, you guys must not do very much calculations, because if that's the case, you definitely want to make sure that's incrementing by 1 and you're not skipping values. So that's important to know. So it's creating tables, creating procedures. Those are two things that you're going to use a lot, definitely a lot in this course. And so I'd suggest mastering those. You can continue reading up on Management Studio and see some of the other tools. For the sake of keeping things simple, I wouldn't touch anything up here. When you go to options though, let's see if I can find it. I always have a difficult time. You go to transact SQL. I'd suggest putting line numbers, because if you get an error, if you get an error, you can go to it. I'm trying to think of how I can show y'all. Let's see if I make a big mistake. Let me do this. Let's see what happens. It'll break. Should break. So you'll see line 3. So the reason why I suggest line numbers, so if you double click on the error, notice what it does. It's really cool. It highlights the line that's erring. But my suggestion is keep line numbers, just because it makes debugging a lot easier. But there's also some options and tools. And again, you can go over all the details, but to get you up and running, this is kind of how Management Studio will look. If you want to get your server name, even though when you first log in, it'll tell you your server name. But again, and it'll say it right here, but you can also do this as well. I was, funny story, a couple of years ago, I was in a job interview, and they had me doing a coding test, and they were really impressed. But I logged into the server, and I was like, it's just one of those, it happens a lot in development, and your brain's like, wait a minute, what's the server name? And even though it was right here in front of me, I typed in select that server name to get the server name. But it happens a lot in development. You'll be in the zone on something else, and so when you're kind of typing and you're in the development zone, you don't even think about just doing that. So it's always nice to know a couple of ways to do something, because you'll understand as you do more and more of it. Once your brain enters a certain zone, it wants to do certain things certain ways. And then, of course, as you create new databases, they will appear under here. I would not touch the system databases. I'd leave them alone. But those are built in, and you should see them. So those are just some basics of Management Studio. Definitely do things through this scripting window, because if you have issues or if you have trouble, it will be much easier to debug than if you go through here. It's going to be really hard to know exactly all of the stuff that you're doing through here, and be careful about deleting. For the record, the command drop database will delete a database, drop table will delete a table, so a drop procedure will delete a stored procedure. So be careful about using the word drop. If you don't know, oh, I just wiped out my entire database. Whoops. So that covers that. Any questions that you have, post, and I'll definitely cover those as well.